the context of looking at both developed market economies and as potential comparative benchmark, and us as emerging market economies. Are we up yet? Just a moment. Yes, you dance, you sing. Okay. Well, I'll get started. Is that as we looked at philanthropic infrastructure organizations, or what some call intermediate organizations, what we wanted to do is we wanted to take a look at, was there a comparative baseline or benchmark that we could start using as we examined our own needs from the emerging market economies and from that model. And so we looked at what DMS would be, developed market, should be an E, developed market economies. All right, and so as we looked at that, we wanted to determine through this kind of Venn diagram, what was there in common? What could we take from developed market economies and looking at how they have their own intermediate organizations have developed in this map of the philanthropic sector? And because if they're more mature, they're more established in the philanthropic sector, and in these intermediate organizations. And if we can do that, then what can we take from their toolbox, in essence, and apply and use on our own? And that would be that common area. And what were outliers? What didn't apply specifically to us? I'm not pressing anything, and it's just moving. Anyway, so what were the common issues? And of the areas that were in common, then we could say is, okay, let's take this well-developed toolbox and see how we can apply the tools. For the areas that were not in common, then we were going to say is, what could be similar across the emerging market economies themselves? And in order to do this, one of the members did a great presentation, Holly did, on developed market economies and the infrastructure organizations and the studies and research that have come out of that. And we use that as our comparative baseline. And we discovered that there were basically 10 areas that are those 10 areas? No, I don't think they're listed. Did you list the 10 areas? They're coming up. Here we go. All right. And so no. Are these all 10? You just list them one by one? Anyway, there were 10 basic areas, and I actually think is that once we have our discussion, maybe Holly, you can give a better synopsis than what we're finding here. But so there were 10 common areas of need for capacity and support from developed market economies that we could find and use that were in common. But the areas that were not, and this was what was interesting, is looking at the U.S. as our developed market economy example, we then turned and looked at China as a potential example from a emerging market economy example in the philanthropic sector. And what we wanted to know was China emblematic of similar situations for emerging market economies in philanthropy across the board? And were the differences between us as China or us as an emerging market economy and the developed market economy, and we use the United States, were those differences in common? Because if they were, then we could get common solutions. And what interestingly, that my takeaway from it, and I think some others, was that actually one is the mature market economy toolbox. There are things that could be very useful, from research to some statistics to many of the mechanisms and the capacity building approaches could be very useful. But that in some areas it was not applicable. And in those areas, for instance, one was the maturity of the market itself and the maturity of the givers and for instance, high net worth individuals. Within China, we discovered that most of the wealthy, much younger than we find in developed market economies. So 51 years, first generation wealth as opposed to second, third, and fourth generation. And that perspective changes the whole behavior in giving. And it changes the whole awareness of what giving means. And we can think of things such as how the Ford Foundation has matured over 4 or 5 or 6 generations of Ford family versus newly established foundations, be it in China or Brazil, from corporate wealth. And that there was also a major difference in terms of even the approach to philanthropy itself. This came out of one of our South Africa delegates saying is that philanthropy had kind of a double-edged sword. There was a historical legacy to philanthropy, and that it had in essence been in some ways kind of a more Western or a brought-in concept that in and of itself had some overtones of elitism, and there was some negativity, whereas the more organic philanthropy that one found in the developed market economies didn't have to find compensatory strategies to deal with that historical legacy. And we found that as we talked about it from, be it China to South Africa to all the other countries to Brazil, that historical legacy was actually, although slightly different, it was held in common from the emerging market countries. And so therefore the approach to giving, the approach to awareness raising of how to give well, and the like was something that was shared between us from the emerging market economies as opposed to the developed market. And so what we felt is that it was in essence two toolboxes that we wanted to be looking at. One was from the developed market, and then one was one that we have shared between ourselves. And on that one, it's less mature and less well developed. And so that perhaps in that area we need to share best practices among us as a group and have a much more of an awareness of that shared best practice. And as we started telling stories, and I discovered this in the other workshops that I attended, more as just a participant than as a facilitator, that it seemed the biggest takeaway from most of the participants were some of these shared best practices, and to be able to take that home and apply it themselves. And that was something that I was surprised at, because coming here I thought that given the difference in continents and cultures and the like, that maybe there would be more differences than there would be commonalities. And we looked at it from these intermediate organizations, but from whatever perspective you look at, it seems that there are actually more common areas and common approaches to problems that we need to be sharing in order to be able to take advantage of them. Thank you.
Thank you.